I am proud to deliver this, my second report on Ontario's climate-changing greenhouse gas emissions, to the Ontario Legislature. I want to thank the team that worked so hard to put this report together, many of whom are sitting here. Last year, I talked with Ontarians from all over the province about climate change. We talked about what each of us can do and about the future we owe to the young people we love. Meanwhile, the news keeps getting worse. Climate change is worsening hurricanes, floods, droughts, and forest fires. And greenhouse gas emissions continue to grow around the world. We know that more human, economic, and environmental disruption lies ahead. It's too late to just talk about climate change. It's time to act. Fortunately, Ontario has a lot to be proud of. Ontario was one of the first jurisdictions in the world to close all its coal-fired power plants. The last coal-fired power plant in Ontario was shut down in April 2014, and that summer was the first on record without a smog day. In 2015, the year after we stopped burning coal, Ontario's greenhouse gas emissions were the lowest they have been since 1990, when reporting began. Our emissions dropped even as Ontario's population and economy continued to grow. This is a real achievement. Since the Climate Change Action Plan was released a year and a half ago, the Ontario government has adopted an impressive range of climate-related policies. Ontario joined many other jurisdictions in putting a price on carbon pollution. This is a crucial tool we need to slow climate change. When people pay for greenhouse gas pollution, they do more to avoid it. And if they can't avoid using fossil fuels, they do their best to use them more efficiently. The method that Ontario has chosen to put a price on carbon is called a cap-and-trade system. 2017, its first year, went well. The allocation of carbon allowances went smoothly, and the first 4 auctions raised $1.9 billion to support future emission reductions. Of this, $1.37 billion had been allocated by November. These funds are going to projects that support the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in Ontario. 99% of those allocations met the requirements of the Climate Change Mitigation and Low Carbon Economy Act. Many worthy initiatives have been launched with the proceeds. Ontario's new carbon market link with Quebec and California creates a combined market of 61 million people. This should keep costs down for Ontarians, for Ontario families, and provide more flexibility and opportunities for business. Business concerns about predictability were partly resolved when the government set its caps on allowances for every year until 2030. Meanwhile, Ontario emitters can use the carbon market to raise capital to update their equipment, and we also saw improvements in how some ministries incorporate climate change into their mandates. For example, improvements to the building code will improve the energy efficiency of homes and buildings. The long-term infrastructure plan is starting to incorporate climate change into infrastructure planning. Municipalities will now bring energy costs into capital budgeting, and municipalities are now empowered to adopt climate change bylaws. There is, of course, also a lot to improve. For example, Ontario's current climate policy lacks clarity on how to reduce the 18% of Ontario's greenhouse gas emissions that are not covered by cap and trade. These are mostly non-fossil fuel emissions from agriculture and waste. The province plans to encourage emission reductions in these sectors by allowing them to sell credits for carbon offset projects. Offsets have huge potential for cost-effective emission reductions and for a flow of funds to rural and remote areas, but if offsets are not done right, there may be more costs than benefits. Some of Ontario's proposed offset protocols should not go ahead. Number 2, The province is getting better at spending carbon auction proceeds on projects that support emission reductions. But by next year, Ontario needs a clearer plan to tie what it does with the money to the climate goals that it must, by law, achieve. Each ministry and sector should be accountable for staying within an explicit carbon budget and should account for how they use the cap and trade money that they spend. 3, the government needs to walk the talk. Ontario's pledge to make its own operations carbon neutral so far covers less than half of its true greenhouse gas footprint. It doesn't yet recognize or even report the other half. Since the landmark Paris Agreement in December 2015, the international community has moved from whether to reduce greenhouse gases to how. Ontario is doing the same, moving from plan to progress. My recommendations will help the province meet its climate obligations, especially, first, working with California and Quebec to ensure that the linked market works effectively and that offset credits have a real impact. Second, getting more bang for each buck of cap and trade revenue. And third, making sure that climate change is prioritized in government decision-making. Climate change is happening now. We are seeing impacts around the world and right here in Ontario. It takes time and consistency for government actions and public policy to produce results. Still, after a decade of talking about putting a price on carbon, Ontario has done it, and it's working. It's an achievement worth celebrating. Thank you, merci. Questions?
You mentioned that the principles behind the planning are fairly sound for the government and so on. Is it fair to say that more transparency around what gets spent and how it gets spent is needed, and how can the government best achieve that?
Transparency over how they spend the money is very important, and that is now part of my job. We got access to the necessary documents rather late in our reporting year, so we were only able to do a preliminary cut at it. And we looked at what the allocations were until the end of November, and so I'm very pleased to be able to say that most of those allocations did meet the requirements of the Climate Act. We'll be doing a more detailed evaluation in 2018.
And you also mentioned that in the future certain ministries should have certain targets and caps and so on. Which ministries are doing a particularly good job, and which ministries have room to improve?
They probably all have room to improve, but several ministries have done much better this year. The Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, for example, has really done amazing work in its first year of implementing the Climate Act. Ministry of Infrastructure is also really worthy of some particular praise for the way they've stepped up this year, including climate change mitigation and adaptation, both reducing emissions and getting ready for what's coming in the long-term infrastructure plan and in the municipal asset management planning regulation. So those are two that have done particularly good things this year. On the other side is the Ministry of Energy. The Ministry of Energy's long-term energy plan, which came out in November, is incompatible with the climate law. So we put a special report out about that a year ago, and I'm disappointed to see that they didn't solve the problems when they issued the long-term energy plan, and I'll be reporting further on that later this spring.
Just to clarify, is the province on track then to meet its 2020 obligations as it is, or is that contingent on following your recommendations?
We're probably on track. I would expect that from a compliance point of view, Ontario will be able to meet the 2020 target because it includes the ability to use offsets and to buy allowances from outside Ontario. It's much more challenging moving forward from 2020 to 2030. We now know what the maximum number of allowances will be each year, but we don't know how the province intends to get there. So that's one of the reasons why I've recommended a specific carbon budget for each ministry and each sector. That's worked very well in other countries. Otherwise, the temptation is for everyone to say, those guys should do it. And it's only if each ministry is accountable and has to report how they're going to get there that we start seeing concrete plans.
What kind of impact would a potential shift to a carbon tax have on reaching those goals?
The research that we've seen suggests that changing policies delays progress. There isn't any jurisdiction in the world that has changed from cap and trade to a carbon tax. Most jurisdictions choose cap and trade because although it's more expensive to implement, for the economy as a whole, you produce the same level of emissions for a lower cost. So most jurisdictions are choosing cap and trade. Both of them can work. The other thing that's important for Ontario to note is that the federal carbon tax minimum price is likely to be much higher, to cost more than the cap and trade price is likely to be. So that means that the costs for Ontario families and businesses would go up much more steeply.
Do you have any concerns about the forthcoming year and how the cap and trade market might change with California and Quebec?
There are lots of reasons to think that the market may not be as strong, particularly in the first half of this year, partly due to political uncertainty, partly because California has just finished a 3-year compliance period, so the California emitters don't need to buy yet. But that's designed into the market. Markets go up and down. We have a compliance period for Ontario averaged over 4 years, so I'm not going to get too worried about what one particular auction does or another.
So we might see a dip in 2018, but that wouldn't concern you?
Correct. You seem to be the only one with questions. Do you have any others? Okay.
No. I'm good. Don't put me on the spot.
Great questions, please. Any questions? That's it? All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. If you think of more questions afterwards, you know where to find me.
Absolutely.
And we'll be doing a webinar on the report, so we'll be walking through each chapter in much more detail on the 15th of February. It's a complicated area. It's a big report, and we know you haven't had much time to look at it. So, but we'd love to help you if we can. Thank you.